Top 5 Dangerous Mountain Disasters in History. Are you ready to uncover the most riveting mountain disasters in history? From deadly avalanches to treacherous rock slides, these catastrophic events will leave you on the edge of your seat. Join me as we explore the top 5 most dangerous mountain disasters that have shaken the world. Let's start with the first one, tragedy on the Eiger. 1936 disaster. The 1936 Eiger Disaster is a renowned and tragic episode in the history of mountaineering, involving an ill-fated attempt to climb the north face of the Eiger, a notoriously dangerous mountain wall in the Swiss Alps. This particular face of the Eiger, known as the Nordwand, North Face, had a reputation as one of the most challenging climbs in the world. The climb in 1936 led to the loss of 4 young climbers from Germany and Austria, and their story is one of intense courage, as well as fatal miscalculations and extreme conditions. Here's a detailed account of the event. During the 1930s, nationalistic fervor and competition in Germany and Austria fueled an intense interest in mountaineering, particularly among young climbers. The north face of the Eiger, which had never been successfully climbed, became an iconic and highly coveted prize. The German and Austrian governments encouraged mountaineers to take on this challenge, hoping for a triumphant ascent that would showcase the strength and skill of their climbers. Nicknamed the Mordwand, Murder Wall, the North Face was known for its treacherous weather, constant rockfalls, avalanches, and sudden ice showers. The wall was difficult because of its size, nearly 6,000 feet, technical difficulty, and extreme weather conditions that could shift from clear skies to violent storms without warning. Many climbers dreamed of being the first to conquer it, but numerous attempts had ended in injury or retreat. In July 1936, 2 German climbers, Toni Kurz and Andreas Hinterstoisser, and 2 Austrian climbers, Eddie Rainer and Willy, formed a team with the goal of ascending the Eiger North Face. The climbers were highly skilled and experienced for their age, having made successful climbs on other challenging routes. They believed their combined experience and skill would help them overcome the dangers of the Eiger's formidable wall. The 4 climbers started their ascent on July 18, 1936. Initially, they made promising progress. Andreas Hinterstoisser famously attempted an innovative maneuver, which would later be called the Hinterstoisser Traverse, a difficult horizontal crossing on an exposed section of the face. He managed to cross it using a complex system of ropes, allowing the team to continue their climb. However, they made a critical error. They removed the rope after crossing, thinking they would not need it on the return. Soon after, the team encountered challenging weather conditions that slowed their progress. Clouds enveloped the mountain, bringing snow and freezing temperatures, which increased the danger of falling ice and rock. To make matters worse, Willy was injured by falling rock, which left him weakened and struggling to keep up. This injury slowed the group down significantly, preventing them from making good time or reaching a safe position on the mountain. Faced with worsening weather and Angera's deteriorating condition, the team decided to turn back. However, as they descended, they reached the Hinterstoisser Traverse, which they now had to cross in reverse. Without the rope they had previously used, the traverse became impassable. They were effectively trapped. The climbers spent a desperate night on the mountain, exposed to the elements without adequate shelter. The situation grew dire as the storm intensified, with heavy snow and winds battering them and temperatures dropping sharply. The storm made rescue efforts from below nearly impossible. Over the following day, one by one, the climbers perished from exhaustion, exposure, and injuries. Willy, already severely weakened, was among the first to succumb. Eddie Rainer attempted to anchor himself on the mountain to aid Toni Kurz, but he also died from exposure and exhaustion. Finally, only Toni Kurz remained alive, dangling from his rope. A rescue team reached him, but his position was so precarious that they could not reach him directly. In one of the most heartbreaking moments in mountaineering history, Kurz managed to untangle himself and descend a few more feet toward the rescuers, only to be stopped by a final knot he could not untie due to frozen hands. Exhausted and suffering from hypothermia, he uttered his final words, "I can't go on," before dying within sight of his would-be rescuers. The tragedy shocked the world, and the climbers became posthumous heroes, remembered for their bravery and determination in the face of overwhelming odds. The north face of the Eiger continued to challenge climbers in subsequent years, claiming more lives until it was eventually climbed successfully in 1938 by a German-Austrian team led by Anderl Heckmeyer. The events of 1936 became emblematic of the deadly allure of the Eiger and inspired numerous books, documentaries, and films. The mountain's north face remains one of the most notorious climbs in the world, but advancements in climbing technology, equipment, and experience have made it safer than it was in the early 20th century. The 1936 Eiger Tragedy highlights both the physical and mental challenges of extreme mountaineering. It serves as a reminder of the relentless forces of nature, the dangers of ambition without adequate caution, and the risks inherent in exploring the world's most treacherous environments. But this was just the beginning. Let's move on to our second disaster, which took place on the treacherous Cairngorm Plateau. The 1971 Cairngorm Plateau disaster is one of the deadliest mountaineering tragedies in British history and a significant event in outdoor education. In late November 1971, a group from Ainslie Park School in Edinburgh embarked on a mountaineering expedition to the Cairngorm Plateau. The trip was organized as part of the Duke of Edinburgh's award scheme, a popular youth program in the UK that encourages personal development through outdoor challenges. The group consisted of 6 teenage students, ages 15-16, and 2 leaders, Catherine Davidson, a 21-year-old physical education teacher, and Raymond Leslie, an 18-year-old volunteer assistant. The plan was to hike across the plateau and reach a mountain bothy, or shelter, as part of a 2-day expedition. The group was relatively well equipped for typical cold weather, but may not have been fully prepared for the extreme winter conditions that would soon set in. The weather forecast had indicated worsening conditions, including snow and high winds, but it's unclear how detailed or accurate the forecast was at the time. In any case, the group decided to proceed with the hike despite these warnings. The group began their journey on Saturday, November 20th, 1971, from the Quarciers car park near the Cairngorm Ski Centre. As they ascended the plateau, the weather deteriorated rapidly, with conditions quickly becoming severe. Snowfall increased, winds intensified, and temperatures plummeted, creating a near-blizzard situation. Visibility was reduced to almost nothing, and the group became disoriented. As they struggled in the storm, they lost their bearings, and navigation became increasingly difficult. In an attempt to find shelter, the leaders decided to head towards the Fife Buida Bothy, a stone-built emergency shelter on the plateau. However, the storm was so intense that progress was extremely slow, and several group members were beginning to show signs of exhaustion and hypothermia. Realizing that they would not make it to the bothy by nightfall, the group leaders decided to dig a snow hole as a last-ditch effort to create a temporary shelter against the freezing winds and heavy snow. Digging a snow hole involves burrowing into deep snow to create an insulated space, which can provide some protection against the elements. The group huddled together in the snow hole, hoping to survive the night. When the group failed to reach their destination the following day, concerns spread, and local authorities were alerted. Mountain rescue teams were deployed to search for them, but the extreme conditions, strong winds, blowing snow, and near-zero visibility made the search exceedingly difficult and slow. Helicopters were also brought in to assist with the search, but the weather grounded most flights, further hampering rescue efforts. After nearly 48 hours, on the morning of Monday, November 22nd, rescuers finally discovered the snow hole. Tragically, they found that 6 of the 7 students had succumbed to hypothermia, along with leader Catherine Davidson. The only survivor was 15-year-old Sheila Sunderland, who was found alive but severely weakened by hypothermia and frostbite. Rescuers immediately provided emergency aid and transported her to the hospital, where she eventually recovered. The Cairngorm Plateau tragedy remains a somber reminder of the unforgiving nature of the mountains and the importance of respect for extreme weather conditions. It profoundly impacted outdoor education in the UK, inspiring greater caution and better preparedness in youth expeditions. This event underscored the importance of adequate training, risk assessment, and equipment in mountaineering, leading to safety improvements that continue to influence outdoor practices today. Ultimately, the Cairngorm disaster highlighted the critical balance needed between adventure and safety in outdoor education, and the responsibility of leaders to protect young participants in unpredictable and often dangerous environments. As if that wasn't enough, our next story takes us to the rugged peaks of the Soviet Union. Let's look at the Lenin Peak Tragedy. The 1974 Lenin Peak mountaineering tragedy is one of the most devastating events in the history of Soviet mountaineering, marked by the deaths of 8 climbers from a Soviet women's team on Lenin Peak, located in the Pamir Mountains on the border of Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan. At 7,134 meters, 23,406 feet, Lenin Peak is one of the highest peaks in the former Soviet Union and was a popular objective for Soviet mountaineers due to its relative accessibility and lower technical difficulty compared to other high mountains in the region. However, the altitude itself posed significant challenges, and the mountain was known for sudden storms, extreme cold, and unpredictable weather, particularly above 7,000 meters. In 1974, Lenin Peak was chosen as the site for a major mountaineering event to mark the 50th anniversary of the Pamir expeditions. As part of this commemorative event, multiple Soviet teams attempted to summit the mountain, including an all-women's team, an endeavor intended to showcase the strength and skill of Soviet female climbers. The Soviet Union had a tradition of training highly skilled mountaineers, and Soviet women climbers were no exception. The women's team that attempted Lenin Peak in 1974 consisted of 11 climbers, led by Lyudmila Agranovskaya, a respected and experienced mountaineer. These climbers had all completed rigorous training and were considered capable and strong enough to tackle a peak like Lenin. The expedition was meant to demonstrate not only the capability of Soviet female athletes, but also the strength of Soviet mountaineering in general. The climbers were equipped with typical Soviet gear for the time, which, while adequate, lagged behind the technology and quality available to Western climbers. The team was determined and highly motivated to reach the summit despite challenging conditions. The women's team began their ascent in early August, following the standard route used by many climbers attempting Lenin Peak. The first days of the ascent proceeded without major issues, as the team established higher camps and acclimated to the altitude. However, as they reached higher altitudes, conditions began to worsen. By August 5th, the team had established themselves on a high ridge near the summit, planning to make their final push. But as they ascended, a severe storm struck the mountain, bringing high winds, freezing temperatures, and heavy snowfall. The storm soon turned into a full-scale blizzard, with temperatures dropping dramatically and visibility reduced to near zero. This sudden shift in the weather made it extremely dangerous to continue, but the team was already positioned on an exposed ridge, with no easy route down. In such conditions, even experienced climbers face life-threatening challenges, and the women's team was trapped by the storm at high altitude with little shelter. The extreme cold, high winds, and lack of visibility quickly created a dire situation. The storm intensified overnight, and attempts by the team to maintain warmth and shelter were largely futile. The extreme altitude, combined with the brutal weather, led to rapid deterioration in their physical condition, and several team members succumbed to hypothermia. The limited shelter they had on the ridge was insufficient to protect them from the freezing temperatures, and as the storm raged on, more climbers began to perish. Despite their experience and training, the conditions were far too severe, and there was little the climbers could do to protect themselves. 8 of the 11 team members ultimately lost their lives in the storm. Only 3 women managed to survive, but they were severely weakened by hypothermia and frostbite. The bodies of the deceased climbers were later found on the ridge, frozen in place. News of the tragedy reached the base camp, and a large-scale rescue operation was launched by Soviet authorities. However, the rescue teams faced immense challenges. The weather remained poor, making helicopter access nearly impossible. Ground rescue efforts were hampered by the same high winds, extreme cold, and deep snow that had trapped the women's team. When rescuers finally reached the site, they were able to retrieve the bodies of the climbers and assist the 3 survivors. The survivors were transported down the mountain and received medical treatment, but they suffered from severe frostbite, shock, and trauma. The 1974 Lenin Peak tragedy was a severe blow to Soviet mountaineering and the outdoor community. It drew attention to the extreme dangers of high-altitude climbing, especially when faced with severe weather. The loss of the 8 climbers, who were skilled and determined mountaineers, brought great sorrow to the Soviet Union and served as a tragic reminder of the risks of such expeditions. The 1974 Lenin Peak tragedy stands as one of the most sobering events in mountaineering history. It reflects the immense power of the natural world and the importance of humility, preparedness, and caution in extreme conditions. The legacy of the tragedy lives on as a reminder of both the ambitions and the dangers of high-altitude climbing, inspiring generations of climbers to respect the mountain and prioritize safety over success. Now, we head to the mighty K2, where a series of events in 1986 led to one of the most catastrophic climbing seasons ever recorded. The 1986 K2 tragedy, known as one of the deadliest seasons on K2, involved a series of tragic events on the world's second highest and notoriously challenging mountain, resulting in the deaths of 13 climbers. The events of that summer revealed the harsh realities of high-altitude climbing on K2, nicknamed the Savage Mountain for its steep and technical routes, unpredictable weather, and dangerous terrain. The 1986 disaster exposed the extreme risks of climbing K2 and forever changed the mountaineering community. At 8,611 meters, 28,251 feet, K2 is considered one of the most difficult and dangerous mountains in the world. Located in the Karakoram range on the border between Pakistan and China, K2 has earned a reputation as more technically demanding than Mount Everest. Routes up K2 are steep, the weather is frequently unpredictable, and there is a high risk of avalanches, rockfalls, and sudden storms. Fewer than 400 people had reached the summit by the mid-1980s, and many had perished attempting it. In the summer of 1986, multiple expeditions from around the world converged on K2, hoping to capitalize on recent successes and favorable weather forecasts. Some of the notable climbers on the mountain included British climbers Alan Rouse and Julie Tullis, Austrian climber Kurt Diemberger, Polish climbers Wojciech Wroż and Tadeusz Piotrowski, and American Rick Ridgway, among others. As climbers ascended, complex social dynamics, communication challenges, and, ultimately, severe weather would create a tragic sequence of events. The 1986 season began with optimism, as climbers prepared to tackle both the traditional Abruzzi spur route and the more challenging Polish route. However, tragedy struck early in July when 2 climbers, Maurice Berard and Liliane Berard, a husband and wife team from France, went missing after reaching the summit. They were last seen descending the mountain, but bad weather moved in, and neither was ever seen again. Their deaths cast a shadow over the expeditions, but other climbers continued with their summit plans. Soon after, Polish climber Tadeusz Piotrowski, renowned for his skill and experience, perished while descending the mountain. Piotrowski had reached the summit with Jerzy Kukuczka, a fellow Pole and one of the most accomplished high-altitude climbers. The two had attempted a new, extremely challenging route on K2's south face, which was named the Polish route in their honor. During the descent, however, Piotrowski fell to his death in a tragic accident, leaving Kukuczka to return alone. Piotrowski's fall highlighted the extreme difficulty and technical nature of the south face. As July ended and August began, several teams were in position to make summit attempts. Among them was a team led by British climber Alan Rouse, joined by Austrian Kurt Diemberger and British mountaineer Julie Tullis. Rouse, an experienced climber and known leader, was hoping to complete his first K2 summit attempt. Diemberger and Tullis, who had been climbing partners for years, were also eager to summit K2, which they knew would be a crowning achievement in their careers. On August 4th, a window of good weather opened, and multiple climbers, including Rouse, Diemberger, and Tullis, began their final summit push. Conditions initially seemed favorable, and several climbers made it to the summit. However, during their descent on August 6th, the weather took a drastic turn for the worse. A violent storm engulfed the upper slopes of K2, stranding Rouse, Diemberger, Tullis, and several others near the mountain's high camps. With no chance to descend safely in the blizzard, the climbers were forced to hunker down and wait out the storm. For nearly a week, the climbers endured extreme conditions, including sub-zero temperatures, heavy snowfall, and hurricane-force winds. The climbers had little food or water, and the lack of oxygen and shelter exacerbated the challenges. Hypothermia, frostbite, and altitude sickness set in, weakening them and diminishing their chances of survival with each passing day. The storm ultimately lasted nearly 2 weeks, during which time multiple climbers lost their lives due to exposure, falls, and exhaustion. Among those who died were Alan Rouse, who reportedly succumbed to altitude sickness, and Julie Tullis, who perished after falling unconscious, likely due to a combination of exhaustion, altitude sickness, and exposure. Kurt Diemberger managed to survive, but suffered severe frostbite and injuries. Some climbers attempted to descend in the storm, hoping that lower altitudes would improve their chances of survival. Tragically, these descents resulted in additional fatalities. Austrian climber Dobrosława Dodo Wolf fell to her death while attempting to descend in blinding snow, and Polish climber Wojciech Roż also died trying to descend. By mid-August, as the storm finally began to subside, only a handful of climbers remained alive on K2. Those who survived did so at great physical cost, suffering from frostbite and other severe injuries vertical bar. When the storm finally abated, a few climbers were able to descend to safety, albeit in very poor condition. Kurt Diemberger and Willy Bauer were among the survivors, but they had both suffered severe frostbite that required amputation of fingers and toes. Rick Ridgway, who had chosen to remain at lower camps during the storm, survived and was instrumental in coordinating rescue and recovery efforts from base camp. The survivors' accounts of the ordeal painted a harrowing picture of the conditions on K2. Some climbers had exhibited remarkable courage and resilience, working together to survive in unimaginable conditions, but others faced psychological breakdowns and physical limitations in the face of the storm. The sense of isolation, helplessness, and the brutal nature of K2's environment were deeply traumatic, and the survivors endured months of recovery and rehabilitation. The 1986 K2 tragedy left a lasting impact on the mountaineering community and is remembered as a watershed moment in the history of high-altitude climbing. The deaths of 13 climbers, including accomplished figures like Alan Rouse and Julie Tullis, were a profound loss to the mountaineering world. The tragedy emphasized the need for better planning, caution, and respect for the mountain's unpredictable weather. The 1986 tragedy on K2 remains one of the most tragic episodes in mountaineering history. It highlighted the inherent dangers of high-altitude climbing on one of the world's most challenging mountains and revealed the devastating consequences of severe weather, altitude, and difficult decision-making. The lessons from this tragic season resonate to this day, reminding climbers of the risks of K2 and the unforgiving nature of the savage mountain. And finally, we can't discuss mountaineering disasters without mentioning the infamous 1996 Everest tragedy. The 1996 Mount Everest tragedy, also known as the 1996 Everest Disaster, is one of the most infamous events in mountaineering history. It took place during the spring climbing season in May and resulted in the deaths of 8 climbers from multiple expeditions. A sudden and violent storm on May 10th. 11 hit several climbers as they attempted to descend from the summit, leaving them stranded in extreme conditions. By the mid-1990s, the growing popularity of commercial expeditions had changed the landscape of Everest climbing. Although still one of the most challenging peaks, Everest had become more accessible through guided tours led by experienced mountaineers who charged clients substantial fees for the chance to reach the summit. Advances in equipment, improved access, and increased logistical support enabled climbers of varying skill levels to attempt Everest. However, this trend brought with it concerns about overcrowding, a lack of experience among some clients, and potential safety issues on the mountain. In 1996, 2 prominent commercial expeditions were on Everest's South Col route, led by highly respected climbers. One was led by Rob Hall, a New Zealander and founder of the Adventure Consultants guiding company. Hall was a seasoned guide with 5 Everest summits to his name. The other was led by American climber Scott Fisher, founder of Mountain Madness, who was known for his technical skills and strong physical endurance. In addition to Hall's and Fisher's teams, there were several other international expeditions on the mountain, including climbers from Taiwan, Japan, and India. On May 10th, Climbers from Hall's and Fisher's teams, as well as other expeditions, set out for the summit from Camp 4 at 26,000 feet, 7,900 meters, on the South Kernel. The day started relatively clear, and climbers were hopeful for favorable conditions. However, due to congestion on the route and delays in setting fixed ropes, progress was slow, and many climbers reached the summit much later than planned, well after the recommended turnaround time. In the afternoon and early evening of May 10th, as climbers were descending from the summit, a violent storm swept across Everest. Temperatures plummeted, winds increased, and visibility dropped to near-zero conditions, making it nearly impossible for climbers to navigate. The combination of high altitude, freezing temperatures, and the exhaustion from climbing created a life-threatening situation for everyone caught above Camp 4. Some climbers, including guides and Sherpas, managed to descend to safety before the storm intensified. Others, however, were caught in the blizzard on the South Col and higher, including Hall, Hansen, Fisher, Namba, and Weathers. Hall radioed base camp, reporting that he and Hansen were in trouble. As the storm raged on, he became increasingly disoriented and frostbitten, but refused to leave Hansen. Their radio conversations with base camp became progressively weaker until communication ceased. Fisher's assistant guide, Anatoly Bukriv, who had descended earlier to Camp 4, later attempted to rescue climbers despite the extreme conditions. Bukriv made heroic efforts to find survivors and was able to bring several climbers back to Camp 4, but Hall, Hansen, and Fisher remained stranded higher up on the mountain. Weathers, who had been left behind due to his impaired vision, was initially assumed to have died after spending hours exposed to the harsh conditions. However, he somehow regained consciousness on May 11th and, in a remarkable feat of survival, managed to stumble down to Camp 4. Severely frostbitten and suffering from hypothermia, Weathers was evacuated by helicopter, an unprecedented high-altitude rescue that saved his life but left him with severe injuries and amputations. By the end of the disaster, 8 climbers had lost their lives, including Rob Hall and Doug Hansen, adventure consultants; Scott Fisher, Mountain Madness; Yasuko Namba, adventure consultants; Sewang Samanla, Dorje Morup and Sewang Paljor, Indian team on the North Col route; Chen Yunan, Taiwanese climber who had died earlier in the season. The aftermath of the 1996 tragedy left the mountaineering community and the public in shock. Media coverage of the event was intense, with accounts and books written by survivors and journalists detailing the circumstances of the disaster. Journalist John Krakauer, who had been part of Hall's team as a client and covering the expedition for Outside magazine, later wrote the bestseller Into Thin Air, which brought the story to an even wider audience and ignited debates over the ethics of commercial expeditions on Everest. The 1996 Everest disaster remains one of the most significant events in mountaineering history, a stark reminder of the unforgiving nature of high-altitude climbing and the unpredictable conditions of the world's tallest peaks. These tragedies remind us of the dangers lurking in the world's tallest peaks. Which story shocked you the most? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more gripping tales on the Tales of Twists.